So yeah, thanks for that introduction. Just to provide a little bit more context about who Instaclustr is and who I am before we get into it. So Instaclustr is a company that specializes in open source software, and particularly software for large-scale distributed data systems. So Apache Cassandra is where we started, and Apache Kafka, Elasticsearch, the Open Distro, and Redis are our offerings at the moment. And for those offerings, we provide a managed service, consulting and support contracts around all of those things. So I've been Chief Product Officer of Instaclustr for about 6 years now, since the company was very new. And so over the last 6 years, which before that I hadn't spent a lot of time with open source, but over those 6 years, I've spent quite a bit of time in working out what other offerings Instaclustr should have and how we should work with the open source communities, sort of thinking about and delving into how open source really works, and licenses is a key part of that. So this presentation will certainly go into licenses, but it's not a legal presentation on the ins and outs of detailed licenses. It's more looking at the considerations when you're going to use open source software at a high level. What should you be thinking about and evaluating for the licenses, but also some of the things around the licenses like community and so forth. So I'll just try and get to the next slide. So I'm really going to talk about what I consider to be the three key considerations in evaluating open source. So licenses and how it's licensed is the first one. But I think you can't just look at licenses in isolation. You also need to think about the ecosystem. How is it supported? Who's working with that software? And then the key business models that are involved. Most sort of significant, serious open source software requires some kind of business model behind it to keep that maintained, and so you need to be able to think about those as well. And then lastly, a little bit on open source strategy. If you new into open source and you're trying to introduce it into your company, what are some of the things that you should think about? So the first thing to understand about open source licenses is why do you even need a license in the first place? And that actually comes back to copyright, and that all code, somebody owns the copyright in that code. I think people are probably familiar with the concept of copyright, that you write something, typically historically a book or something like that, and then other people can't just go and copy your book and publish it as their own. You own the copyright in that in a book. Similarly, in the code, you own the copyright, which means if other people want to use it, they have to somehow get permission to use that. And a license is how you as the copyright holder in the code give somebody else permission to use your code. So before open source came along, when we were buying software, there were still licenses. They were paid licenses, and that provided people the ability to use pieces of software. With open source, they're generally free licenses, and so those licenses provide people not only the ability to use the software, but also to, depending on the license, to modify the software and give you some other conditions as well in using the software. But I guess that's the sort of foundational concept, is that the license arises from owning the copyright. So to understand who's issuing the license, you have to sort of understand who holds the copyright in that code. One other difference is open source licenses generally are to sort of closed source or proprietary software. Open source licenses are generally perpetual, whereas closed source proprietary licenses often would be for a fixed period of time. But the copyright holder can change the license as they release new versions, and we've seen a bit of that very recently. So this screenshot here is a page from Wikipedia, just summarizing or providing some kind of summary of all the open source licenses out there. So it is a complex area. There are a lot of different licenses to choose from, and some good resources out there to help you understand the different licenses and to choose one if you're publishing your own software. That said, although there are all of those different licenses, there are a relatively small number of very popular licenses, the Apache licenses, the GPLs, those kind of ones, and then the others are a bit more esoteric. So when I think about open source licenses, I generally think about them in three categories, and they're not mutually exclusive categories. Certainly custom licenses can overlap the other two, but these tend to be the key things that people sort of consider when they're evaluating licenses. So the first type of license is what I'd call a permissive license, which basically allows pretty much free use and puts very minimal obligations on the user of the software. And so examples of those are the Apache 2 license, the MIT license, and the 3-clause BSD license. So if you're using software with one of those licenses, it's pretty hard to go wrong in whatever you want to do with it. Most of them require you to if you republish the software to keep the license alongside the software, so you don't take it as your own. A few obligations like that, but they're not terribly onerous. The next type of license is what's colloquially known as a copyleft license. And those licenses allow you to use the software, but require you to make any modifications to the software public under the same license. So the theory is that if you're using a piece of open source software and you modify it, you should have some obligation to make your modifications available to the public the same as the original software was, and the permissive licenses don't oblige you to do that. And examples of this kind of license are the GPL license or the Mozilla public licenses. So both of those, if you do modifications, you're obliged to make those publicly available under the same license. Those licenses do cause corporate lawyers some headaches and some concerns, and it is not. There are quite a number of corporations that would not work with software under those kind of licenses. Certainly wouldn't contribute to the source code. I think Linux is under GPL and pretty much everybody uses Linux, but not everybody would contribute to Linux as a corporation because of that concern. And then the last category of license here is what I call custom licenses. So you can make, licenses don't have to fit in those first two categories. You as a copyright holder can make up whatever license you want. It's your code. You can require people to, send you tribute if that's what you want to use your code. That's your concern. So once you get out of those sort of standard licenses, you really have to be looking into the details to see what's in there. And we're starting to see more and more what we call the open core companies, the companies that are commercializing open source software by putting their own proprietary code around it, using these kind of custom licenses even to cover their core software, generally aimed at big cloud providers, and AWS being the biggest cloud provider, and trying to restrict their ability to use the open source software that the open core companies are spending a lot of money in supporting and developing. So examples of those kind of custom licenses is the Confluent community license, the Mongo server-side public license, Elastic have a license, and Redis have a Redis source available license, covering different parts of the code depending on which of those companies you talked about. So if you're using something with one of those licenses, you really do need to probably should be getting legal review before you start using it, and making sure you're thinking about what's the actual terms of that license, and does it make sense for your situation. With the common Apache licenses and MIT licenses, you can kind of rely on and GPL, you can rely on. There's already lots and lots of people using those, and a pretty good common body of knowledge as to what the implications are, and people have assessed the risks. With custom licenses, you can't really rely on that as much. There can be gotchas in there, and so you should be spending some more time understanding what you're getting into by using software under one of those less common licenses. So just to go through, then these are, as I said, the software that Instaclustr works with, and what the licenses are there, just for some examples. We tend to favor the Apache 2 license, and in fact, and we'll get to in a second, the Apache Foundation software where it makes sense. So Cassandra and Kafka are under those licenses. There's the Kafka schema register and REST proxy is an interesting case, where originally open sourced by Confluent under the Apache 2 license, and then they moved it to the Confluent community license. The open distro for Elasticsearch, which is a distro of Elasticsearch maintained primarily by AWS, that uses the Apache 2 license, and they just provide the Apache 2 functionality out of the core of Elasticsearch. And then Redis is under 3 clause BSD, the core of Redis. And then, as I mentioned, you tend to get into the extensions and things where the vendors are using their custom licenses. So Confluent have got some Kafka Connect connectors and KSQL under the community license. Elasticsearch originally just had the XPack under the Elastic license, and they've recently, in the last couple of weeks, announced that the core of Elasticsearch will be moving under that Elastic license. And as a result, the open distro will be turning into not just a distro, but a fork, and an Apache 2 licensed fork of Elasticsearch. Redis Labs have some extensions to Redis that's under the Redis Source Available license. And then there's a thing called ScyllaDB, which is a sort of rewrite of Cassandra in C, and that's under GPL. So there's a few different licenses out there. As I said, we tend to favor Apache 2. It's a very simple to understand license, and as I said, minimal obligations to get yourself in trouble when you're using it. And large corporations tend to be very comfortable with Apache 2. So that's kind of licenses. The other thing which you need to think about when deciding whether the terms of a license are a risk for you is kind of the ecosystem, because that it determines the impacts of what happens when somebody sort of exercises the terms of a license, or changes the license terms, or those kind of things. So we talked at the beginning about copyright holders, and at the end of the day, the copyright holder to the code base is the one that gets to decide what changes go into that code base. Certainly, or the project owner. Somebody owns the project, gets to decide what goes into that code base. Depending on the license, other people may be able to fork it and make their own copies, but that is dependent on the license. So where the copyright holder is a foundation, that gives you a really good open governance and decision making. So the prime examples of those are the Apache Foundation and the Cloud Native Compute Foundation. They're the two sort of most famous and biggest ones. And so they have a defined governance framework, a defined decision making process that makes sure that all of the stakeholders in the open source software get to influence those decisions, and aim to prevent a single party sort of taking over the project and doing it driving it in a direction for their own commercial benefit. So where you've got an open governance over a piece of software, you can have confidence that it's going to evolve in a way that considers the range of users of that software. That sort of contrasts to where you have an open source project, but the owner is a single corporation or individual. So Elasticsearch is an example of that, where there's the Elasticsearch project, and it's fully controlled by Elasticco in its sort of native form. And in that case, that corporation or individual has basically unilateral decision-making ability as to what they want to add into that project, and if they want to change the license for future versions, and all of those kind of things. So it's really not a lot different to a standard commercial software, in that your proprietary software vendor can basically do whatever features they want, change the license fees however they want, all those kind of things. Depending on the license, though, you do have the fallback of, as we've seen with Elasticsearch, of somebody, including yourself, creating a fork of that software and going your own way. And that's where the difference between a permissive license and a copyleft license, for instance, can become important as to whether it's feasible to make that fork. It's also where this next slide, when you consider, is it a realistic, is the idea of somebody, making a fork, a realistic risk mitigator for unfriendly license changes? And when you're thinking about that, you need to think about, well, how widely used is the software? And that's both in terms of the fork, but also, when you're deciding to use the software, and will it be maintained ongoing? So looking at whether there are many large users of an open source project certainly is a good sign for stability. If you know that, in terms of, say, Cassandra and Kafka, you've got people like Apple and Netflix making really heavy use of that software, you can be pretty confident that they're not just going to walk away one day and the software's not there. They've got massive amount of money invested in it. They're at least going to keep it alive for a while. And similarly, actually, when we looked at first supporting Elasticsearch, we looked at exactly this risk and evaluated that, well, there are a lot of people using Elasticsearch as open source software, not paying Elastico for support and so forth. And the license, was under Apache 2, so it allowed for people to create a fork, and basically decided that chances are, if Elastic did the kind of stuff they've done recently and started to tighten up the licenses, or change the licenses to be restrictive, and also derive in the wrong direction, that there's enough people out there with the resources and the skin in the game with Elasticsearch to create a fork, which is exactly what's happening. So you can rely on, if there's really big users using the software, that software is going to continue to live for a while. The other thing to look at is there another general ecosystem around it? Are there consultants, managed service providers, people using it as part of an integrated solution? They're all people who have an incentive to keep that software alive ongoing, and all give you increased confidence that you're not going to end up as the one user in the world of a piece of managed service software, a piece of open source software, and be stuck with the full maintenance of that yourself, which is generally a big thing to take on. So then the final axis I like to think about when we're deciding to use a piece of open source software is the business models of those companies that are involved in the software, and understanding who are the big companies that are backing any particular software and what are their business models can help you think about where is that software likely to go in the future, what are the risks to my business in adopting this software. So I, again, generally look at sort of three key business models that we see around open source software. One is the open core model. People are probably familiar with that term. DataStax and Confluent are two examples in the space that we play. Where they're contributing, the core of the software, Cassandra and Kafka, is owned by a foundation. It is true open source. It's not controlled by those companies, but they do invest quite heavily in maintaining, building that, and and creating buzz around that software. But then they seek to take that core true open source software and create proprietary extensions, and that's what they license and sell to their customers, essentially, along with support sometimes. The thing to keep in mind with those kind of companies is that they can invest a lot in the core of the software, but at the same time, they need to be creating their own proprietary extensions to keeping enough value in those proprietary extensions that they can justify the license fees that they're charging. What you tend to see, and we've seen this in a few projects now over time, is that although they want to keep their proprietary extensions, The community, if it's a really valuable extension, will want an open source version of that, and it gets harder and harder for them to maintain a proprietary differentiator from what's in the open source version, as people contribute open source versions of the type of functionality that they have in their proprietary extensions. So there can be a bit of a tension there, but they certainly can provide a lot of resourcing into certainly those two have a lot of VC funding, put a lot of money into the project themselves. The next one is what I'd call the open source IP owner. So in Elasticsearch, Scylla, a couple of examples of those, where it's talking about it's the single corporation that really owns the project and all of the code. I'd say question. Yeah, they're kind of using open source for marketing to help get themselves moving, but as we've seen, they always retain, with Elasticsearch, they always retain the ability to change the license to suit their requirements, suit their commercial motivations over time. So they, don't tend to have such a community contributing. You do have to be evaluating the broader community and the health of the core company itself when deciding to use those software. And then the last big player, and the sort of perhaps slightly controversial player over the last few years in open source, is the cloud providers. So obviously AWS being key ones, but GCP and Azure are also key users of open source and investors in it. I think you can, where a cloud provider chooses to offer a piece of open source software as a managed service, I think generally they are big companies with deep pockets. They do provide stability and a real stamp of maturity around open source projects. Unlike the open core providers, they don't tend to invest in the community development around the open source, so sponsoring meetups and those kind of things around them. Traditionally, they haven't necessarily invested a lot in the core product, but I think we are starting to see that change from AWS in particular, where when they pick up open source projects, they tend to invest back into the projects a little bit more. Often those investments are very slanted to integrating with the cloud provider's proprietary technology rather than core features, but it does certainly provide some stability and so another place that can be contributing bug fixes and so forth. So again, understanding when you're looking at a new piece of open source software and you're going to make a major commitment to your using it as part of your architecture and to your business, understanding who the big players are in that project and that piece of software and what are their commercial motivations can help you think about, where is this software likely to go in the future. So final section I want to talk about was just a little bit how to open source strategy, or thinking about how your organization goes about moving to more significant use of open source in their application architectures. So the first thing with any kind of strategy that you're going to be thinking about is the business case. Why does it make sense to do this? And so, I think when you're looking at a business case for open source adoption, the big and when I think about this, I'm really talking about true open source, not an open core proprietary version of an open source software, but using the actual open source directly out of a project. So that in doing your business case, the positives, the benefits that you're going to be looking at from open source will be obviously removing license costs, whether that's open core costs or proprietary software that you're using, and again removing the risks of the future license increases. When you're using proprietary or open core software, what you're paying today is not necessarily what you'll be paying tomorrow once you're well and truly locked in. The other big benefit we see a lot of people citing is that it removes the need to think about to design your architecture with license costs as a consideration. So both in proprietary software and with cloud provider services, we have a lot of customers who say, "Oh, we just spent too much time having to worry about how much it was going to cost us if we built something this way or that way. We use open source software. We do have to think about how much hardware we're using, but it's a much simpler equation to work through, and stops us having to build architectures purely to drive on license or cloud provider costs. And then, the final sort of benefit, enabling new use cases. We do see open source is often the place where a lot of innovation is happening and is ahead of proprietary software in a lot of areas. And some use cases really just require use of that open source software to make them able to be implemented. So there are your benefits. The costs you need to think about, obviously, if you're moving from proprietary software to new software, the ops tooling and training staff to be able to support the software. And then the other one you need to think about is, using a piece of, using true open source, you're basically becoming your own support provider if you use it directly from there. And if there's a bug, you need to feel confident that you're able to work through it and fix it. You can't. An open source project is under no obligation to fix a bug to your timeframes, or you can engage external support for your software, and that's an area where Instaclustr has offerings. The next thing, I think, if you're a large corporation getting into open source, you're obviously going to need some policies and standards, because you need policies and standards for everything if you're a large corporation. And some of the things you'd want to be thinking about there are how you're going to review, test, and accept products before you adopt them. You shouldn't just be that any developer can go and pick a random piece of open source and build it into the core of your architecture. The service introduction process, it's, again, is in Instaclustr. One place we often get called in is dev team's gone away and built something using a piece of open source software that we support. They've got to 3 weeks away from prod, and this is the first that the ops team has ever heard about it and doesn't know how to support it. It doesn't have the tools to manage it. So you need to be thinking about that ahead of time, and how we're going to train our ops team. Do they have the tools? How do we do backups? How do they monitor it? All of those kind of things if it's a new piece of software. And at a policy and standard level, putting down those things that people need to think about. Again, policies and standards, which we talked about for the governance and licensing models. How are we confident that this software is going to be around for the long term and not going to change in ways that harm us over the long term? And as we talked about a second ago, how are we going to support that? How are we going to diagnose and fix the bugs? Because, again, the project is not an obligation to do that for us. How do we configure it? How do we monitor it for issues? And all those things need to be thought through. So diving a bit more into service introduction, it's for open source technology, it's not really that different to proprietary technology that most organizations may be more familiar with. But it's pretty common that open source software kind of assumes a higher level of operational capability and an ability to build it. There's less hand-holding, if you like, from generally from open source software. So you need to think about things like your ops tooling, as I said, the provisioning, backup, monitoring, those things, the procedures for all of those things. The enterprise standards is a big one to think about for large enterprises, security integration, all of those kind of things. How do we integrate with our analytics and business intelligence? Does it have drivers for the corporate software that we use? All things that you need to think about. So that was kind of the end of my quick run through all of that stuff. Obviously, this is an area that Instaclustr specializes in, and just sort of summarize how our services fit into all of that. Obviously, in deciding to offer a piece of software, we go through all of that, thinking about all the licenses and the business models and the community around it. So we providing some assurance that it is a longer term viable piece of software. And we actually have support reports around that consideration that we've done that are available on our website. And then, in the more technical aspects, basically our managed service is where we do the ops for you. So we've done that service introduction. We have all of the tools there. You can just get up and use it. The support service is about, removing that support burden. You don't need to feel like you can fix the bugs yourself, that you can work those out yourself, but we've got a team there to help you to do that. And in the consulting, we can help you with everything from the strategy to the business case, and then through the deep techie details of the implementation and the operations and all of those kind of things. That's where we go. So that was the end of my presentation. We'll open up for questions now. Just trying to find the...
Great, thanks. I think if you can click the Q&A, we have quite a few questions over there.
Okay, I found it now. Okay, so first question, if I use a GPL licensed Python library, import statements not distributing as binary in my software, and ask customers to install it on their own, due to the virality of GPL, does it also enforce GPL license on our software, or are we free to make a choice? So my understanding, and I'm not an open source lawyer, so if you're really concerned, you may want to check that. But my understanding is if you use a library, that's not modifying the library, and so you're not therefore obliged to republish your stuff. And certainly, if the customer is installing a piece of software that happens to have a GPL component in it, that doesn't sort of spread out to their thing. And as I said, Linux is under GPL, and pretty much everybody uses Linux as a user without concern. That said, I do know some corporations are very nervous about GPL, so I wouldn't be surprised if you're trying to sell that software if occasionally you run into procurement departments and so forth that have some concerns that you've used GPL anywhere there. So depending on your target market, that might be a factor. Next question, what risk is involved in contributing to a GPL project? You mentioned that some large corporations would not want their employees to contribute to GPL. Oh, sorry, it's just my Q&A thing moved. You mentioned that some large corporations don't want their employees to contribute to GPL program even if they use the project. So I guess the risk is, once you have the GPL source code there, and then you're sort of using that alongside your own source code for your own application, that somehow the two become intermixed, and you end up with an obligation from the GPL license to publish some piece of code that you actually wanted to keep proprietary. I guess if you trusted all of your developers to do a really good job of never intermixing the two and never modifying a GPL library with some proprietary code that you want to keep proprietary, then that would be okay. But the risk is, and I think it's anyone who's worked in a dev project, a big dev environment would see it's a real risk that once the source code for that GPL thing is there, the temptation to modify it to get something to work and then intermingle it with your proprietary code becomes too much to avoid, and it happens. And then once you've intermingled the GPL code, modified GPL code with your application, I suspect that it's going to be pretty hard for the lawyers to draw the line about where the GPL code finishes and where your application starts, is kind of the risk that people are concerned about there. Next question, what's the most permissive of the widely used licenses, Apache 2, MIT, or 3-clause BSD? I think they're all pretty permissive. Hard to answer which one is the most permissive. 3-clause BSD is the shortest, so that probably suggests something. But there's not a lot of practical difference between the three of them. I've looked at 3-clause BSD a bit because we do Redis. I haven't looked in a lot at MIT, and I'm reasonably familiar with Apache 2. But there's not a lot of difference in how we treat them. So I think practically they're pretty much the same. Next question, does Instaclustr sell use of GPU clusters? If so, do you have NVIDIA V100s? No, we don't sell GPU clusters. So we run on, we provide our own infrastructure. So forth. We run on AWS, Azure, GCP, and on-prem. And none of the software that we provide really demands GPUs. So yeah, we don't work with GPUs at the moment. Should we get into that, then we might. I think that's covered the questions. Oh, got another one. Can you elaborate further on the case of a company owning most of the IP for the open source project, example, patents beside the codes? Yeah, patents is a good question. And it's not an area that I've had to look into a lot. But it's another way, I guess, that companies can protect their IP in a project. Most of the so my understanding is that most the foundations, so Apache Foundation and CNCF and some other project, you have a requirement that if you contribute code, it's a contributor license agreement, which basically is giving the project and the foundations of the copyright owners license to any patents that are needed to use that. Yeah, that said, there can still be accidental patent infringement. Yeah, I guess it's another area where if you're the single corporation that's managing a piece of software and they've called it open source, but they're the only people that really control the project, and that project is using patents that they hold, then they're pretty strongly signaling that they haven't really embraced true open source and given that code to the community to do whatever they want with. They're publishing the source code so you can look at it and hoping that you will perhaps contribute some fixes and enhancements to do some work for them, but very strongly holding the capability for themselves to do whatever they want in the future with that code, whether that's change the license, whether that's move it to license fees. If they have patents plus they own the copyright of the code and it's entirely controlled by them, then in the future they can if they want to turn it into a completely proprietary piece of software. And if they've got patents in particular, you can't fork that software because you would be in violation of the patent. So I'd take it as a pretty strong signal that that they're at least holding that option for themselves to do those kind of things. Another question, if someone contributes to a GPL project, is there some risk of not owning their patents, even if those patents are not used by the GPL code? Yeah, patents are not an area I've looked at a lot. Yeah, it is an area of risk. There's a number of, I've actually just was looking the other day at a foundation that existed, I think was Microsoft, one contributor to it, a pretty big foundation that does a lot of work in gathering together patents and making sure they're available for open source projects. And as I said, most of the contributor agreements require you to say that there's no patents or that you're handing the patent over. So I think it's an area that's been flagged as a risk with open source for a long time. I'm not aware of anyone actually, certainly recently, taking patent action against open source projects. I think there might have been one sort of 15 years ago or those kind of things. It's another area where you can sort of think a little bit about the commercial interest of those who might hold the patents and would it really make sense to go after open source software. And it's something that again, mature projects, people like Apache Foundation and CNCF are quite cognizant of and do things to protect people against issues with those. If I was working in, this being the ML list, if I was working in a more cutting edge area where like machine learning and those kind of things, and a bit of a more niche project, a small project that's kind of out there, a small company that's published an individual piece of, individually controlled piece of software, then I would, certainly think a little bit about, do they actually have a patent in this open source software that they've published? Because then I've got an ongoing obligation to them if they change the license on that patent. Am I aware of any evildoers intentionally putting malware in an open source project? Not in a significant well-governed open source project. I think there was a case in a few years ago. I don't know if it was malware, but something in Node.js. They've had a few issues like that where they have a massive sort of tree of small contributions that all add up to a Node.js library, and one thing well down the dependency tree might be controlled by some guy in his bedroom and can change it without much governance on it. That's less of an issue in the kind of projects that we work with, where there are sort of very public development processes and multiple reviews required before a piece of software gets committed and published and those kind of things. And I haven't heard of it or seen it in any of those significant projects.
Great. I think we have a few more minutes. If you still have questions, feel free to post in the Q&A. Again, also, if you prefer to speak to ask questions or even comment some of the highlight some of the topics, feel free to raise your hand. We can unmute. You can speak to talk. I just see another one coming.
Yeah, I did see that. Any thoughts on AI data processing algorithms for humanitarian applications where open source licenses are used to safeguard usage? Not something I'm familiar with at all, I'm afraid. But yeah, I guess that's an example of those kind of custom licenses where, as I said, you can make a license that says that has any condition in it. So certainly, I can imagine that it could be something where you're doing AI algorithms where you put license conditions to not use it for making military devices or those kind of things. Certainly could be a condition you could add into a custom license. Why is Apache 2 your favorite license? Probably partly because it's the one we're most familiar with. It's a very popular license. Again, it seems to be very good at encouraging people to contribute to the software. People feel like they can contribute with minimal risk of having downstream obligations. It's pretty straightforward to understand what you can and can't do with it, and I guess it goes hand in hand with the Apache Foundation, which, as we've worked with software governed by the Apache Foundation, provides a really good basis for a project to be governed and moved in a direction that benefits its users. If I release my software with GPL license today and would like to modify the license for newer version later, does GPL let me do it as a copyright owner? So I'm pretty sure the answer is yes, without having checked the details of GPL. You'd probably want to have a scan through and check there's nothing about that. Thing to be aware of is that you can you can change the license for the newer version, because the newer version is a new piece of code. The people who have begun using GPL as a perpetual license, so people who've used your older version or taken a copy of your older version still maintain the right to use that older version under GPL, but the newer versions, I think you should be able to change to use a different license. From your experience, which entity, company, other is actively monitoring, pursuing enforcement on open source license? So I haven't seen any actual enforcement actions on those. I guess they may exist. I don't know. But a lot of companies, and as a small startup, a small company, you may be prepared to take the risk about whether you're actually fully in compliant with an open source license, or most small startup companies, you're probably not consciously aware of whether you are or not, because you're too busy just trying to make things work. But once you get to big corporations, then you have internal people who worry about whether you're in compliance with licenses, because the risk, should you be found to be uncompliant, is quite significant in a big company. So it's probably more internal compliance concerns that drive it, rather than actual risk of somebody enforcing an open source license. I guess that there have been cases, it's not, I can't think of a specific example, but I'm pretty sure there's been kind of cases where people, more sort of publicity around is this way that somebody is using a piece of software in compliance with the license, should they have published their modifications, or their application is their application a modification, and therefore the license should be published. So there can be, although it's not somebody strictly enforcing it, it's sort of adverse publicity from potentially not being compliant. And I have seen, we didn't talk either as well, I have seen the Apache Foundation take action on its copyrights in the names of the projects and those kind of things, where they thought that commercial companies were using the name, the name of an Apache project too closely aligned with their commercial variants of that project. Okay, sorry, just scroll down. What is the name of the foundation you briefly mentioned that provide patents for open source projects? I actually can't remember off the top of my head. It's in my email somewhere, so sorry about that. I don't know if we have a mechanism for follow-up answers, but what would you say is the size scale of a startup to start worrying about open source licensing compliance? A little bit hard to answer. I guess as a startup, in the early days, you don't even know if you're going to be here in 3 months' time, and then you probably don't worry about it. I guess it's probably, there is no such thing as too small, but the amount of effort that you put into worrying about it is going to increase over time. So even if you're a one-man startup, you don't want to take a piece of GPL software and build your whole startup based on taking that GPL software and using it to create a commercial variant of that GPL license thing, because if your startup is successful, you're just going to end up in a point where you have to open source your software that you thought you were building as proprietary software. So that would be an example of something where you want to be thinking about open source licensing from day one of your startup life. But if you're in a startup that's new and again, you don't know if you're going to be in a year's time, you're probably going to pick the piece of software, if you're picking from open source projects, you're going to pick the one that fits your use case better, not necessarily worry about, is there enough of a ecosystem and commercial backers to make sure this software is still here in 5 years' time, because if you're in that early stage of a startup, your architecture is probably going to look different in 5 years' time anyway. So it's not necessarily something to worry about. So yeah, there's no easy answer, but those, I think, they're the kind of factors that you'd think about. Is there a difference between including a GPL library as a binary versus importing it? I think I just have to say I don't know on that one. I haven't had to look into that, so I couldn't really give you a useful answer, I don't think.
All right, I think that's cover all of the questions. By the way, for